Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the virtual ISCOS 2020 conference. For the first session this morning, we have a program consisting of 3 papers on the topic of COVID-19 and hardship. So we start with a paper by Missael, Castro and Consuelo, Chua, followed by contributions by Abayomi Daramola and Stephanie Rossouw, Talita, Greyling, Tamanna, Adhikari and Morrison. To remind you, presentations are 30 minutes, so 20 minutes for presentation, 10 minutes for discussion. If you have questions after the presentation for the presenter, you can post them in the chat box or in the Q&A box, and I will ask the question to the presenters. Alternatively, you can raise your hand, and then I will give you the platform, and you can ask your question directly to the presenter. So if we are all ready, then I'll make the first presenter panelist, and then presenter can share his or her screen with us. Good morning, Consuelo.
Good day. Hello. Yeah, I'll just share my slide first.
Yes, 1 minute. I need to. Yes, and now you're able to share your slides.
Thank you very much.
So the floor is yours.
Can you see it? Can you see my slide?
Yes, I can see your slides clearly.
Okay, so good morning everyone. I am Consuelo Chua. I'm from the University of the Philippines, College of Home Economics, and I'm here to present the study entitled Financial Difficulties of Selected Low-Income Rural Filipino Families During the COVID-19 Community Quarantine by Missael, Castro, and yours truly. So allow me to present the outline of my presentation. So I'll begin with the background or the introduction of our study, followed by the objectives, the methods, the results, and of course, the conclusion and the recommendation. So for the introduction, the world is now facing the COVID-19 pandemic that has infected millions of people and has claimed the lives of many. When this study was conceptualized in early June, there were a total of 23,732 COVID cases in the Philippines. This is according to the Department of Health in the Philippines. However, this number has ballooned to over 190,000 at present time. The first few cases of local COVID-19 transmission in the Philippines were reported in early March. In the hope to control the spread of the virus, the Philippine government has imposed different degrees of community quarantine in the country. The entire Luzon, which is the largest and most populous island in the Philippines, was placed under enhanced community quarantine, or what we call ECQ. This is the strictest form of quarantine, and this took place from March 16 to April 30 and up to May 15 for Metro Manila and other COVID-19 hotspots. So I just want to add an information that though we are no longer in ECQ, many areas in the Philippines are still under different levels of community quarantine until today. What is the scenario during the ECQ or the enhanced community quarantine? So under this type of lockdown, public transportation such as buses, jeepneys, tricycles, which is common in the Philippines, is suspended. And as you may know, a large percentage of Filipinos do not own private cars, and 56% of them rely on public transportation. Thus, the suspension of public transportation resulted to a greater portion of the population not having a convenient access to work and other essentials. During ECQ, mass gatherings were also not allowed. Schools were closed and curfew was imposed. And except for essential workers, people could not leave their homes between 8 p.m. and 5 a.m. and only one person per household may go out to buy essentials. All non-essential businesses were also closed, and there were also police and military checkpoints in many areas around the Philippines. As a result of these restrictions, many people lost their jobs. Some could not work because they do not have physical access to work, or they lost their jobs because of temporary or permanent business closure. Fortunately, the hardest hit were poor families who are living on a daily minimum wage. The unemployment rate rose from 17.5% in December to 34.5% in March. This was when the ECQ was imposed. And let me just add, currently the unemployment rate is already 45% in the Philippines. This is according to the SWS survey. It is against this backdrop that this study was conceptualized. We are home economists, our profession is home economists, and we wanted to find out the financial difficulties that ECQ has brought to low-income families who are the most adversely affected by this crisis. We also wanted to determine how the families cope with the situation. So here are the objectives of our study. Number one is to determine the financial challenges that selected low-income rural families faced during the ECQ. Number two, describe the strategies that they applied to cope with their financial challenges. And number three, to identify their plans to prevent similar financial challenges in the future. Let us now move on to the methods of the study. The study utilized a qualitative research design wherein in-depth interviews were employed to gather data from the respondents. Our goal was to hear stories of the families about their financial struggles, about the financial struggles that they encountered during the ECQ and how they faced these challenges. Let's now proceed to the sampling procedures. Due to the ongoing community quarantine, we could not leave our homes to search for respondents. We were not allowed to leave, and it was very dangerous to leave the house. Thus, we relied on the referrals of acquaintances to reach our target respondents. Through these referrals, we called potential respondents through their mobile phones to ask for their consent to join our study. In the end, we were able to invite a purposive sample of 10 rural families with monthly income of less than 10,000 pesos or $200 US. We wanted to interview more families, but access to them was not possible. For each family, the person in charge of the family's finances, which usually was the mother or father, was interviewed. This slide shows the profile of the families. As you can see, the family size of the respondents ranged from 2 to 6 family members, and most of them were high school undergraduates, and all of them were living on a daily wage as either as vendors, laborers, housekeeper, cook, and others. For the data collection procedures, an open-ended questionnaire was used to collect data. And since the study was conducted during the ongoing pandemic, face-to-face data collection was possible. Instead, the data was obtained by calling the respondents through their mobile phones, and we did our interviews through the mobile phones. As for data analysis, we used the qualitative data that ensued from the interviews were analyzed using thematic analysis. I'll now move on to presenting the results of the study. This slide shows the financial challenges that the families faced during ECQ, which will address the first objective of the study. Since the families had limited resources or savings and were not really ready for a lockdown or for a pandemic, all families except for one experienced financial challenges. All the families experienced either job loss or decreased working hours, and this includes the family who did not experience financial difficulties. The respondents or their spouses lost their jobs either because they were not allowed to go out of the house to work or because their work of place were closed. This led to a total loss of income for some of the families. Other respondents did not entirely lose their jobs but were given lower working hours because of the curfew that was imposed during the ECQ. For a few respondents who were vendors, they could not go out of the house to peddle their items. The decreased working hours led to a lower income for the families. And as a result, excuse me, the families found it very difficult to obtain their basic needs such as food and medicines. However, there was one family who did not experience financial hardships because they were able to save before the pandemic. So respondent 2 shared their financial struggles because her husband lost his job. So according to respondent 2, it is really challenging because my husband is the only one who works for our family. Because of the ECQ, he lost his job. Obtaining our daily needs became a struggle. This ECQ became a huge challenge for us because you cannot buy things without having a source of income. As for respondent 6, who was pregnant at that time, she shared how it was difficult for her to obtain medicines and nutritious food during the ECQ. According to her, it is difficult to obtain food. I also cannot buy prenatal vitamins or the nutritious food that I need now that I'm pregnant. Because of the ECQ, the place where my husband works is closed. He has no income. And for respondent 4, providing for our financial needs became hard because I lost my job. My husband still has a job but is receiving a lower salary because of fewer working hours. Rather than working until late night, he works until early evening, till noon only. Since the families had limited income to no income at all during the ECQ, they had cash assistance from the government. Their employers, some employers would give cash assistance to the employees or cooperatives. Some also relied on financial help from relatives. They also relied on the relief goods that were given either by the government or by private groups. And they used this to sustain their basic needs. So the relief goods usually consist of rice and canned goods. However, the financial assistance and the relief goods were limited and barely enough to sustain their needs over the 2-month ECQ period. Let's now look at the coping strategies that the families apply to deal with their financial situation. So given the financial challenges that the families faced, we asked them about the coping strategies that help them deal with their financial situation. Filipinos are known to be very resilient, and as expected, they were quick in devising ways address their financial situation. They did not simply wait for outside help, but also look for other possible sources of income while in home quarantine. And based from the interviews, selling simple items such as at home, such as ice candy, snack items, vegetables, and rice was a primary strategy that they used to earn extra income. They set up makeshift stores in front of their houses and offered goods for sale to their neighbors. The money that they earned, though limited, helped them provide for their basic needs during the ECQ. According to respondent number 4, what we did to earn income was to make ice and ice candy and sold this to our neighbors. We will also our neighbors. And according to respondent 5, he said, I have a sideline. I sell rice and simple snacks outside our house. There. The financial assistance and the relief goods that the families received to sustain their basic needs over a 2-month lockdown period. Thus, aside from selling goods, the families resorted to tight budgeting. The second strategy that they used, so they resorted to tight budgeting of their money and strict allocation of the relief goods that they received. They had to stretch their income and apportion the relief goods to last them until the end of the ECQ. And while devising ways to make ends meet, the family also relied on their faith in God and on prayers to cope with their financial burdens. Filipinos are generally religious and display a strong faith in God. They commonly resort to prayers to deal with difficult situations. So according to respondent number 2, we make it a point not to overspend. We make sure that our expenses do not go beyond whatever money we have. We have to be very thrifty. And according to respondent 5, we need to have faith in God and to pray. And respondent 10 has a similar response where she said that whatever happens, I always lift up our situation to God because at times like this, we could not rely on anyone. Let me now move on to the results pertaining to the family's plans to prevent similar financial challenges in the future. All families except for one were not financially prepared to deal with the pandemic. When we asked them about their plans to prevent similar financial difficulties from happening again, the most common response was that they realized the importance of allocating more income for savings. They shared that they should make it a point to set aside an emergency fund to prepare for similar future emergencies. And aside from saving, they also shared that they will continue looking for extra sources of income, such as continuing selling to prevent future financial troubles. According to respondent 2, now I realized the importance of saving. It doesn't matter whether it's small, but we have to save so that we have something to rely on during emergencies like this. And for respondent number 4, we can do many things to be prepared. We will continue selling out to earn more income. We will sell goods in our house so that we do not have to go out. To conclude, the families in the study were vulnerable to financial difficulties during the enhanced community quarantine because they were living on minimum wages and have limited savings. All families except for one struggled financially during the ECQ because of job loss or reduced work hours. The financial difficulties drove the families to strive harder and strategize in order to earn income for their families. They also held on to their faith in God to survive the financial difficulties. And last, the families realized the importance of saving and preparing for an emergency fund to prevent similar financial challenges from happening again. As for my recommendations, the current study showed the adverse effect of that the ECQ has brought to the families 3 months ago. And as we all know, the sample size of our study is very limited. However, the COVID-19 situation in the Philippines has become much worse since then. Community quarantine is still ongoing in the country. Many businesses are operating on reduced capacity. Some businesses are temporarily closed while other businesses have closed permanently. As a result of this, the financial situation of many families, not only from low-income groups, but also from other income levels as well, are adversely affected. In fact, according to a July 3 to 6 SWS survey, 36% of adult Filipinos expect their quality of life to worsen in the next 12 months. Therefore, studies that look into the financial struggles and other quality of life outcomes of different family subgroups, such as left-behind families, families in business, middle-income families, should be considered. This ends my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Many thanks for your presentation, Consuelo. Are there any questions? So you can raise your hand or put a question in the chat box or Q&A box. Yeah, there's a question from Ming Chai. Ming Chang, you can ask your question, Ming Chang. You have to unmute.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to know about the state response to the the financial difficulties in the Philippines. You sort of mentioned about the state, giving help, but I'd like to know what kind of helps the government provided at this moment, and what is the effect of this policy response?
Okay, so currently, since the start of the ECQ, the government tried to provide some financial assistance to the families, but then not all families were given because there were certain criteria in order for you to receive the cash amount. And of course, the cash amount was also limited because since until now, we're still in community quarantine, so a lot of people lost their jobs. So I think the amount that was given was only enough for probably 1 month or 2 months. But since the community quarantine has been ongoing for 5 months already, it's really not enough for the families. So a lot of families are struggling now. So but aside from the government, many other private organizations are helping, many non-government organizations are helping to help these families. So it is really a community effort to help the families who were affected by the pandemic. But as for government assistance, although they are doing something, it's really not enough to sustain the needs of the families, of the affected families.
Okay.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah, sort of, because we're here in Taiwan. We are very close to the Philippines, and actually,
yes.
Yes, the government at this moment, also provide financial support, which is about $70 for each person. So
Wow.
compared to Philippines, I don't know what the government give.
In the Philippines, they were given around, I should say per family. At the start of the ECQ, they were given around $100 per family. But then it's not really, that's per family, it's not per individual. So it's not enough since, as I've said, the ECQ, the community quarantine has been ongoing for 5 months already. So $100 for a period of 5 months is not really enough. Although some families, I think, received it twice or thrice, but still it's not enough. And as I've said, not all families were given because there is a criteria, meaning you have to be very, very poor to receive it. But then there are many like low middle class and middle class families who also lost their source of income because of business closures. And unfortunately, they are not qualified for this, financial assistance.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. There was a question here by Pauline. Can I answer it here? She was asking how assistance from the government was distributed. So unfortunately, most of the financial assistance was distributed by the families or the people going to the community hall. So the families had to line up to get the money. So this was another source of, and sometimes social distancing was not really implemented. So this is another cause of transmission, of COVID-19 transmission. But then for other local governments who were more organized, they actually distributed the money and the relief goods house to house. So it actually depended on how organized the local government unit was.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for Consuelo? No? Then many thanks for your great presentation.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and then I will make you attendee again, and we'll go on to the next presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning, Abayomi. You can unmute, and then he can probably hear you. So we can at least see, or at least your presentation is starting up. And if you can push the button in the corners, because we can't hear you at the moment. So the mute button.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
All
Great.
right, thank you very much.
I can see your presentation, so please start.
Thank you very much. My presentation is on economic hardship, unemployment, and poverty severity induced by COVID-19 pandemic outbreak. I'm trying to, all right. This is the presentation outline of my presentation. Now, the impact of this coronavirus has affects a number of people and multiple effects on dwellers, especially people that live in resource-constrained nations in Africa. This poses a huge danger to their public health, sustainable development indicators, and their well-being. In spite of this obstruction of the coronavirus, there's additional obstruction in the supply and demand chain, which was globally and the same thing locally. So a lot of our economic indicators were affected negatively. A majority of people in Africa or resource-constrained nations, they operate in unorganized sectors. They operate in informal sectors of the economy. So for them to survive depends on their daily existence and activities. They have to go out every day to transact because they cannot really save from their income. Now, looking at the nexus of unemployment, economic hardship, and poverty severity, you can see that they all have a point at which all have impact on each other. The pandemic affects people differently. People with resource constraint were affected more, but people well off above poverty line were not affected that much in times of survival. Some of them already have stock of food that can last them for longer period. But for people at the lower echelon, they cannot have any store to store their grains or even have food. So this inequality, though it has been there before the pandemic outbreak, but it's more, the inequality was greater due to the pandemic. Most of the rapid review literatures that have been published on COVID-19 outbreak concentrated on clinical cases and clinical trials, but few have looked at economic hardship faced by inhabitants of sub-Saharan Africa. Therefore, this research sought to analyze the observable unequal access to remote education and remote entertainment. It also looked at digital exclusion, economic hardship, unemployment, and poverty severity. And some studies indicated their findings. This study wants to fill the gap in the COVID-19 literature by having to gain insight to well-being challenges as a result of obstruction of economic activities in sub-Saharan Africa during this COVID-19 pandemic outbreak. A number of literature were reviewed, and the theory that was used to explain this is biopsychosocial theories that looks at how it affects them in three spectrums: the physiological, psycho, and social. Because it was difficult to go out, the lockdown, content analysis from various discussion, online discussion were used, and some discussion on channel news were used to make this analysis. The results shows that population of people living below $2 in Africa has increased more than before. Another significant finding is that unemployment and economic hardship is demonstrated in selected target economy that was used to evaluate this study: Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, and Ethiopia. The level of unemployment, economic hardship, and poverty have adverse effects on the overall well-being of the dweller of sub-Saharan Africa. Distress arising from economic hardship have implications for the level of well-being, as evidenced by coronavirus-induced psychological distress. A lot of people suffer depression, panic, and all that anxiety. Poverty and economic hardship have now reached the level of pandemic itself. So effect of economic hardship on well-being of dweller of African nation might spark up physical and mental health disorder. Inequality in income, as evident by social, digital, and financial exclusion among the disadvantaged populace. So looking at it in conclusion, economic hardship, unemployment, and poverty have multiple impacts on the well-being of people that are living below the poverty level, and they not have any resource to utilize or to save up towards the pandemic outbreak. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present.
Many thanks, Abayomi, for your interesting presentation. There's at least a question from Talita, and I will give her the platform. Hi, Talita, you can ask your question.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your presentation. Lovely to see a colleague from Africa. I quickly want to ask you, I find the results very interesting. Which data did you use? You did say that you used big data, but interesting your estimations on poverty for sub-Saharan Africa, your inequality estimations. Can you tell me more about that?
More about
specifically the data you used for poverty and inequality, and how you went about calculating those.
Okay, the data to use to judge the inequality was published by Nigerian Bureau of Statistics 2020, and it was a World Bank sponsor project. They used telecommunication to reach out to some people that were interviewed. And another one that was done for Ethiopia, which was also published, it was the research team, as I projected on the screen, Wesa and Bell Borden did the research to indicate on the effects of the coronavirus as it affects the community in Ethiopia. So those were some of the work that was used for that aspect.
Can I have a follow-up question?
Okay.
Exactly which data sets did you use? Is it only a Nigerian data set? Was it over which time period?
Okay. The data sets that were used, like I said, online during the pandemic, there were various discussion on news channels that reach out to impact on communities. And it was focus group discussion because reaching out to the community directly was not possible. So that was how those information were analyzed, the content of the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much.
For your question, are there?
It was qualitative, it was qualitative study.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Are there any other questions? I see no other questions. I have only a small suggestion. Abayomi, if you are interested in also adding to your rich qualitative data also some quantitative data, you might want to look at the enterprise service of the World Bank, who have also a special section on COVID-19, and it covers also African countries, and you can obtain the data for free. It's really accessible.
Sorry, I didn't get the data, the quantitative you mentioned.
Yeah. So it might be nice to combine with your nice qualitative story.
Oh, thank you. Please, I just want to get the data, so you advise me to consult.
Yeah. So I put the link in the chat box.
All right.
Look whether it suits your study.
All right. Thank you. It will surely enrich it. I appreciate it.
Any other questions? No. Then I thank you for your contribution, Abayomi. Many thanks. And I will make you attendee again. Okay, and then we move to the next presentation by Talita, Stephanie, and Philip. And let me see, we have all, Tamanna, we have to add. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Martijn.
Yes. Yeah, great. So I not know who is about to present, but
that would be me.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And the floor is yours.
Right. Thank you. So first, before I start speaking, I would just like to thank you, Martijn and Joel, for everything that you've done to make this conference run so smoothly. We really, really appreciate it. And Martijn, you still look very good for somebody that is full in today too. So we did a paper on New Zealand, and we used the Markov switching model to see whether there are different states of happiness within New Zealand. And this is a series of papers that we've done. So this one includes myself, Talita, Tamanna, and then Philip, or Phil, like we call him, that spoke yesterday about New Zealand. Now, when Phil spoke yesterday, I quickly had a thought. You know, some of us really know where New Zealand is, know the name, but for many people, New Zealand, they don't know where it is, they don't know where it's located, and they've got no perspective. So I quickly made this slide that says, where in the world is New Zealand? So if you look at your bottom right-hand screen, you will see a red question mark. Now, it happens so many times that New Zealand gets left off the world maps. Don't ask me why. We're here, but we get left off the world maps. But we are here, right there. We're at the edge of the world and at the bottom of the world, which is not a bad place to be, believe me. So New Zealand is it's got about 5.5 million people, and we are the land of Lord of the Rings. We are the country that has got the Kiwi and, of course, the other Kiwi. We have the infamous All Blacks, and we have some of the most beautiful nature scenes that you will ever see in your whole life. And do not listen to the Australians. You have got the New Zealanders to thank for the pavlova. So that is just a little bit background of the country that we're going to be focusing on. So the background in terms of what has happened with New Zealand is that the New Zealand government has been one of the only countries in the world that went fast and hard as soon as COVID hit our borders. The first confirmed case for New Zealand was reported on 28 February, and only 27 days later, on 26 March, did we go into full lockdown, which was mandated stay at home, only leaving your house for essential services or goods. And you could go out for exercise, but you had to stay in what we called your bubble, and you weren't allowed to interact with anybody else. New Zealand is also the only country that has been able to keep COVID out for 102 days after we did have COVID originally, although we're very sorry to say that it broke out again on the 11th of August on a Tuesday, and very, very quickly, the 12th, the very following next day, we went back into level 3 lockdown, where we are still in lockdown level 3, coming out on next Monday. But 102 days is a record to celebrate. So the significance of the study is that it's important to understand the dynamics of happiness, as well as the factors that is most likely to increase happiness levels post-pandemic. Talita and I had a discussion today about it, and I think it's time that we realize that the DNA, the makeup of what makes us happy has changed from pre to post COVID-19, and it might never be the same. I don't think it will ever be the same. So understanding the dynamics of happiness will now undoubtedly allow policymakers greater insight also into the implications for economic behavior. So the aims of the study is, there are a few aims. So the first one is to identify whether or not there are more than one state of happiness in New Zealand, considering the time period before and after the first COVID-19 case. We also want to see what the likelihood is of switching between states, and we want to determine the factors that are related to happiness for the time period after the COVID-19 pandemic began. So the contributions, fourfold. First, study to investigate dynamics of happiness using the Markov switching model. It's also the first study to use the Markov switching model in a time period that includes a global pandemic. It's one of a handful of studies that uses big data methods combined with other data collection methods. So you all know about Hammermesh and Brodeur and the other papers that we've done with gross national happiness. And then it's one of the handful of studies that focuses on happiness and not mental well-being per se. Now the methodology, the Markov switching model. So to determine the dynamics of happiness and to see whether there are different states, we fit a Markov switching model to the daily gross national happiness data for the period from 1 January 2020 to 25 May 2020. Now what the Markov switching model in essence does is it determines whether there's more than one state in our gross national happiness time series. Now, one way in which it does achieve this is it looks at the mean of the gross national happiness index to see whether it has changed significantly from one period to the next. Now, we are limited in our covariates, but we control for COVID-19 cases as well as lagged gross national happiness. We would have liked to add more additional covariates, but we are limited due to the number of observations that we have. We do report robust standard errors to correct for the heteroscedasticity inherent to high-frequency data. Additionally, the states that gets identified by the Markov switching model, we classify as either being happy or unhappy states. we are able to estimate the transition probabilities from moving from one state to the other, and we are able to calculate the expected duration in each of the two states. The methodology for our second objective, which is to determine which factors are related to happiness, we make use of your standard linear model and OLS estimations. I do have to say, though, that there is a possibility that some of our independent variables may be correlated with the editor, and of course then leading to indigeneity concerns, which implies that the coefficients that we see could be biased upwards or downwards. But in the absence of panel data or an appropriate instrument, it's difficult to assess the likelihood of endogeneity. You try saying that word a lot of times. Endogeneity, and also make predictions related to causality. So just keeping those limitations in mind when we go through the results. So the covariates, reminding you that the time period under consideration is 1 January to 25 May. However, to determine what matters most to happiness for the period after the first confirmed COVID-19 case, we consider the period of 28 February to 25 May, which is 88 days. Now, we're very aware that economic factors have got a significant influence on happiness. So we selected an economic sentiment, which is a confidence measure. We have border crossings, our daily arrivals and departures into New Zealand, and we use this as a proxy for international travel. We've got daily searches on Google Trends for jobs as a proxy for job uncertainty in the future. And we have data on weekly job seekers allowance payments to proxy benefit payments. So that is a scheme run by the New Zealand government. However, after running various estimations or diagnostic tests, we found that, let me just go back. After running various diagnostic tests, we found that the Google Trends for jobs as a proxy for job uncertainty and the job seeker allowance were highly correlated, and we chose to only include the job seeker allowance payments in the model. To represent other things that are important to happiness rather than just economic, we add the lack of mobility, and we saw this coming through very strongly from analyzing the tweets. We have the number of tweets per day for New Zealand, and we use that as a proxy for connectivity. Obviously, we've got the number of COVID-19 cases for our exogenous shock, and the happiness measure, the dependent variable, is the gross national happiness index, which very, very shortly, we used a live stream of tweets and run sentiment analysis and the sentiment analysis algorithm, balance algorithm, and create a happiness score from 0 to 10, 0 being unhappy, 10 being happy, and 5 being neutral. This is the descriptive statistics for the variables included in the estimations of happiness. So you can see we've got the daily COVID-19 cases. We're acutely aware that the trend is now to either look at cumulative or the deaths. This study was conducted in, I think we finalized in May. We finalized it in May. So the idea is to go back and do look at other possibilities there. The economic sentiment is an interesting one. Like I said before, it is a confidence measure, and we got that from the Gedelt project that measures the economic sentiment at ground level. So results on the unobserved states of happiness. So what we see from the Markov switching model is that there clearly is two states. The mean for the unhappy state and the mean for the happy state clearly differ, which shows us that there has been a change in the happiness. There's been a switch from one state to the other in the time period under consideration. We also see that gross national happiness lagged, as well as the COVID-19 cases are significantly related, associated to the happiness states. In terms of the transition probabilities of switching between states, So what we see is if you are in a happy state in time 1, then the probability of you staying in a happy state in time 2 is 0.97. Simultaneously, if you are happy in state 1, then the probability of you becoming unhappy in time 2, then the probability is 0.03. If you are unhappy, then the probability of you becoming happy in time 2 is 0.21. Whereas if you are unhappy, the probability of you staying unhappy in time 2 is 0.78. What about the expected duration in each state? Well, what we can see is that the mean duration for the unhappy state to last is only 4.6 days, whereas the mean duration for a happy state is 31 days. But what we do see is that the happy state has got a very high standard error. Now, what this high standard error does show us that there is a great uncertainty in the number of days New Zealanders are expected to remain in this happy state vis-a-vis the unhappy state. What we can see is that the unhappy state that New Zealanders find themselves in due to COVID, it's not expected to last long. But due to this exogenous shock of the pandemic, it can be that the state is prolonged and could last beyond this expected duration of 4.6, which gives us a little bit of pause for thought to think that there might be a need for some affirmative policy intervention. What did we see when we did the OLS estimations? Now we saw that came out quite clearly is that the job seeker assistance, border crossing, and mobility were significantly related to the gross national happiness. Now, the border crossings is an interesting one because New Zealand is very much dependent on international travel. So when the borders closed, it was like a dual impact on New Zealanders. First, you had that economic shock. The majority of the people that are employed in tourism or service industry, they had that significant effect from the economic side hitting their income. But there was also this social shock, because not only are New Zealanders not allowed to travel back then overseas still, but we were also not allowed to travel domestically. And New Zealanders are very social beings. So that was a very big hit for them. So what are the conclusions that we could see? Well, we definitely found that from the Markov switching model, New Zealand's got two states of happiness, happy and unhappy. And it does seem that the switch came because of the first COVID-19 case that was announced in February. We also found that when we are in an unhappy state, the probability of moving to a happy state is relatively small. And this unhappy state that we find ourselves in, and I want to say yet again, now that we're under lockdown, might be lasting longer than we would have anticipated originally. And the factors that we found that was significantly related to happiness, like I said, was job seeker assistance payments, border crossings, and mobility. Now, we really do think there is scope for policymakers to intervene and to not just lift the happiness levels to pre-COVID levels, but to see if we can go back to what we found in 2019. And they can do that through various avenues. They can do the normal shtick, you know, create employment opportunities, invest in retraining. They can do that. But for a time being, there was this great discussion in New Zealand about creating what was called a trans-Tasman bubble, in which, you know, we were COVID-free. Australia, I don't know what's going on in Australia, but as soon as Australia got their stuff sorted out, they would create this trans-Tasman bubble, which would allow international travel between the countries, which would open up the economy a little bit, get people back in employment, get people traveling. New Zealanders travel a lot. New Zealanders, in the year 2019, over 1.6 million New Zealanders, that's 35% of our population, traveled overseas. So that would give them a little bit of their normal back. Additionally, there's 21 countries in the world that never had a single case of COVID. And fortunately, a lot of them lie just to the right of us or top of us. I don't know, my geography is not very good, but it's the Pacific Islanders, island nations that are COVID-free, and they very much depend on travel and tourism themselves. So there was this possibility, it was raised, that we can create and extend this trans-Tasman bubble to include countries and nations such as Samoa and Tonga and the Cook Islands that desperately needs travel, especially from New Zealand. But now everything is up in the air. And that's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for this great presentation. Are there any questions for the presenters? Kelsey, I'm going to give you the platform.
Yes, hello, Stephanie. Thanks for the presentation. So I'm not familiar with the Markov switching model.
Yeah.
If I understand correctly, the finding is that there are two means during this time period.
Yes.
Okay, and so presumably they moved from a happier mean to a lower mean. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the two states are definitely, can I go back? Yeah, so the two means are definitely different, and the unhappy state has got a lower mean of 6.49 than the happy state.
And so right now, you're not showing us over time, so we don't know when these occurred, or I mean, it's kind of simultaneous, if I understand. But presumably, it's what they did is they moved more from this happy state to a low state.
Yeah, but what the Markov switching model allows you to do is it pinpoints when the switch happened. So usually you would put a dummy variable in your time series, and that would split it up for you into two different periods. But so Markov switching model doesn't do that. You just feed in the time series data, and that determines the precise time of when the switch happened, which we saw was when the first COVID-19 case was announced in February, and that caused the switch from the one state to the other.
Okay, so I guess, so I missed part of that. I know you said it. I think if you'd shown us, that might also help. And then you could potentially show us the distributions under the two states, and that would also really make it visually quite clear.
Okay.
I'm just thinking because it's not the most intuitive unless you've worked with this before.
All right. Thanks, Kelsey. We will definitely do that. Do a graphical representation.
Yeah. So that's helpful for clarification. I had one more question. Okay. So I think it's just forward one slide. You have the probability to switch. It looks like the probability to switch from unhappy to happy is much higher than the probability of switching from happy to unhappy. Is that correct?
So the probability of switching from unhappy to happy is 0.21, whereas the probability of switching from happy to unhappy is 0.03. So we have a very high persistent happiness state in New Zealand. So it does take a lot to move New Zealanders out of their happiness state.
So this makes it difficult to see how people became less happy.
Absolutely. The thing that we saw in the beginning, people weren't, right in the beginning, New Zealanders weren't very concerned about COVID-19 itself per se. It was when the economic indicators, the economic circumstances started changing that people's happiness really started feeling it. The thing about the New Zealanders' happiness is that up until now, we're not quite sure what is going on. We have this second lockdown that happened, like I said, in August, and the happiness fell to its lowest since it was recorded last year and May. And what we saw is there's a shift. So yesterday, you remember you saw that there was this declining trend in the happiness from last year to this year. And major things have happened in New Zealand over this year. I think we all can remember the mosque shooting and the 51 people killed in Christchurch. So there has been, and then we've had 3 earthquakes, major cities that have been impacted by roads closures. So there has been things have been happening. And every time there's a shock, happiness falls, but there's resilience built into New Zealanders and they bounce back. The thing is, we don't think they bounce back as far up as where they were originally. So every time they bounce back, they'll go up a little bit less.
Okay.
So it takes a lot to move them out of happiness, but once they are unhappy, it's going to be very difficult to turn them back.
Yep. Okay, thank you. Very helpful.
Thanks, Kelsey.
Yep.
Any more questions? Oops. Martijn? Anybody? Hello?
Oh, yes, I sometimes forget to unmute. So I was talking, but you didn't hear me. There are no other questions at the moment, but I have a question for you. I'm also not very familiar with the Markov switching models, but your study looks incredibly interesting. And I would love to read more about it. What I was wondering when I saw your regressions, is there any possible way also in these Markov switching models to account for things like adaptation and anticipation effects?
I have no idea. I'll be completely honest with you. I've got no idea. As far as I know, the Markov switching model determines the switch for you, and you can control for specific covariates.
Steve, would you like me to jump in?
Yes, so where's Tamanna?
Yeah, I'm here, but Talita, you go.
Well, normally with a Markov switching model, it is actually to determine if there are different states. So normally in a time, if you have a time series, you would be able to have sort of a movement around a specific mean. But their mean differs quite a bit, it's probably better to have 2 regressions. Now, what the Markov switch allows you to do is to determine definitely if there are 2 very different means, and then to estimate that. Normally, your application for this would be something like volatility in financial markets, or also very often used in insurance. And then your estimation is like, if somebody gets sick, what is the likelihood for them to become healthy? So we actually used those methodologies and applied it to the happiness literature. If we can use it for adaptation, I think there's better methods than the Markov switch. The Markov switch is very intricate, but I think we can really use it more in happiness studies.
Sorry, can I just jump in for a second?
Yep, no, Tam.
Yeah, so just one thing, the states that we observed, that we have reported in the Markov switching are unobserved. So they are determined by the level of the happiness that's in the period that we consider. Had we considered the period, let's say, before COVID, it is possible that both the states that we have reported would probably have been higher than what they have been now. So it's very dependent on the kind of data that is underlying the study.
Damn, I couldn't hear you clearly. I think there's something wrong with your microphone. Could anybody else hear her?
No, it was a little bit difficult to
understand.
understand.
Okay. I'll just write the answer down in the chat box.
All right, thanks, Tam. That would be great. So the basic idea is, Martijn, is we don't know. We don't know.
Okay.
This is the first time that we've worked with it, and but it's definitely an avenue to explore further.
Yeah. Yeah, and do you also intend to look at countries? It would be nice maybe also to do this in a cross-country comparison. I don't know to what extent it's possible.
Yes, that's the dream. That's the dream.
Okay, are there any other questions? The presenters. Yes, Ming Chan has a question. I'll give you the platform.
In the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned the state had some response, very fast, very effective. But I'm wondering if you put the state policy, state action other than job seeker assistance, what would be that in your model? I'm just curious about this possible factor.
Ming, we in New Zealand we have what we call under Statistics New Zealand, we've got a COVID portal that has got all of it's a fantastic data source, and we ran through all of the variables that we from the literature could identify as being a possibility to influence happiness after COVID-19 broke out. So we had variables to look at internet coverage, electricity usage to describe. We had congestion. We had numerous amounts. We also have on top of job seekers assistance payment, New Zealand has got something that we call the wage subsidy scheme, in which every full-time worker per week gets paid approximately $380 a week just to help them in employment. And the job seekers assistant one was the one that was the clear standout amongst them.
Good. So the financial support from the state matters in the difficult time.
Yes, it's still ongoing. New Zealand released the wage subsidy scheme. We went into lockdown on the 26th of March, and it must have been the second week of April that they rolled out the scheme. In April, we lost nearly 38,000 jobs. Now, you've got to remember, for the size of New Zealand, that's 5 million. That's significant just in 1 month. So they rolled out that wage subsidy scheme very, very close to real time, and it's still ongoing. And we are now in, where are we now? August, and it's been extended until next week that they have been doing this wage subsidy scheme. Tremendous. It's costing the country over $50 billion so far.
Good. Yeah, I think this is very interesting. Compared to many countries, that the state do not have that kind of physical strength. The situation can be very worse. So I just thank you for this point that the state policy matters a lot for improving the quality of life during the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ming.
Yeah.
Okay, many thanks for your question as well. I think that Tamanna offered an answer to the previous question or an additional in the chat box. So you can have a look at that. And are there any other questions?
Martijn, I don't have a question. I just actually want to advertise saying that we will have another paper tomorrow where we actually combine the 3 countries. So we will have some cross-country analysis to compare then New Zealand, South Africa and Australia, which are 3 very different countries.
Yeah, so that will be tomorrow at 8 o'clock. Sharp.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay, so if there are not any questions, can you see the is only visible to panelists? Okay. Okay. I will put in the answer like so. What Tamanna to all panelists and attendees. So, Kelsey, can you see the answer of Tamanna now? Yeah. Okay. Perfect. So then I would like to thank you all for your attendance this morning. It was a great session, and we continue in slightly more than 45 minutes. And hope you enjoy the rest of the program. Many thanks.
Thank you, Martijn. Enjoy your day.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye.